Welcome to Inspire Change, a new inspirational and motivational broadcast that strives to empower, educate, and inspire men in a positive way. Please join me in welcoming Gunter, international psychologist, author, speaker, and producer.
Welcome, everybody, to another episode of Inspire Change. So, as I'm continuing to watch videos and news flashes of the atrocities that the Russians are committing in the Ukraine, it's really raised a very, very important question in my mind. Well, actually, it's raised a whole bunch of them, but in reality, I want to focus on one major one and a couple of others. And the first thing that came to mind is, what are we going to tell our children about this atrocity that's taking place in the 21st century at a time when we had peace for over 80 years, at least in Europe? Certainly, it wouldn't necessarily be the case in other parts of the world, and that's for a number of reasons, but I won't go into those right now. So here we are watching people becoming demolished, just like buildings with bombs, bullets, tanks, missiles, aeroplanes. And as I'm watching this, I'm also reflecting on how lucky we are in our part of the world to remain relatively unscathed about, or unscathed from this problem, from this war. But are we? And this is where I want to dig a little deeper into the whole situation. So as I was sort of contemplating this whole thing, of life and death, war and peace, I kept thinking back on Aristotle. And I ran across a website by Dr. John Messerly called Reason and Meaning, Philosophical Reflections on Life, Death, and the Meaning of Life. And I think this is particularly an important time to start contemplating this more fully, more in depth. Okay? And Aristotle's always had this thing about the good life. It's interesting because, in many respects, Aristotle was an extraordinarily progressive thinker, philosopher. He did get stuff about women completely wrong, but, he was a man of his time. And like Plato, who also got a whole bunch of stuff about women wrong, some of his reflections in regard to what constitutes the good life are really, really important. Now, if he would have thought a little bit more outside the box, he would have realized that he would have needed to include women into an equal place in society rather than seeing them as inferior. So, attached to this issue of the good life is the question of morality. Okay, so one of the things that I ran across was that people are talking about Putin being a war criminal. He's clearly doing stuff that is, even in a state of war, questionable, highly questionable. In fact, I would use the phrase immoral. And so let's take a little bit of a look at what that actually means. So let's go back to the basics with Aristotle. The question of morality in living a good life, what does that actually mean? Well, what it means is while possessing both virtue and luck, and I'm quoting the website, gives us a good chance of having good lives, of being happy, it doesn't completely guarantee it. Why? Because the quality of our lives also depends in large part on the quality of our society and government. And remember, if you've listened to my previous podcast, this is exactly the point that I've been making, is that we cannot simply look at the individual in isolation of the society that individual lives in. And so part of society is actually the issue of government. So to continue with this quote from the webpage, it is exceedingly hard to have good lives in societies with bad governments. Despite our best efforts, and no amount of virtue and good fortune completely compensates for a tyrannical or despotic government. Put simply, we have a much better chance of living good, happy, and meaningful lives in societies with good governments than we do in society with bad ones. So, what is in the end goal and purpose of the state? Aristotle says the purpose of the state is to provide the conditions under which all its citizens can flourish. This implies that some governments are better than others. Good governments fulfill their purpose, whereas bad ones either fail to help or actively hinder their citizens' chances of living well. Just as a bad family doesn't care for its children's well-being, a bad government ignores the well-being of many of its citizens. And by definition, we have a right to expect more. In fact, we have a right to expect that the state uses its power to provide the conditions under which all its citizens can flourish. However, a just government cannot guarantee that we will attain moral virtue or have good lives. That part is up to us. Nevertheless, a good or just government can and should provide the conditions under which living well, a good life, or human flourishing is possible, thereby alleviating much of the injustice caused by misfortune or bad luck. Now let's think about this. This is fundamentally important, and it was so well put that I decided to quote the whole lot in this podcast because it underpins, in my view, the very fabric of potentially a democratic society. And yes, the Greeks were, a democratic society. They didn't quite get it completely right because it was only men that this applied to and not women. Major flaw number one. And secondly, you had to, I think, own land in Greece. I'm pretty sure that's the case. So, some restrictions there. But overall, the concept and the practice was good, was sound. So let's bring that into context in today's world. So here we are now going to bring it into contemporary times. So let me talk a little bit about some of the stuff that I talked about in the last podcast. So I talked about saving democracy. What is it that we really need to do? Now, right off the bat in today's session, I'm going to focus on the issue about climate policies, about renewable energies, about how that impacts on the cost of living. Why? Well, because we're seeing the effects of being slavishly controlled by a dictator and his selling of fuel to the West. We're basically under his thumb because of that. We should have been looking more clearly at how do we protect ourselves from the vagrancy of despot. So one of the things that I talked about in the last session on this was that we need, in order to save democracy, we need to construct long-term climate policies. Okay? So that's basically because we want to create stewardship and not ownership of the ecosystem. So 8 teenagers and a nun last year sought an injunction to prevent Labor from approving a proposal by Whitehaven Coal to expand the Vickery coal mine in northern New South Wales, arguing that the minister had a common law duty of care to protect young people against future harm from climate change. Now, here comes the absolutely staggering part. The full bench of the federal court on Tuesday overturned the judgment that the minister had a duty of care. And the appeal by the minister was therefore successful. Now, to me, now I'm not a politician, I'm not a lawyer, but it seems to me that if you're in a job over which you, or within which you have a duty of care, not only to the outcomes of the job, in her case, it seems to me that she's the environment minister, that it is about looking after the environment. People are part of the environment. And we need to look at the intersection between the environment and people and how the management of the environment affects people. She's off the hook. Now, that to me is just like, here is no accountability. We have a politician who can just basically you know, can do whatever she wants, and there's no challenge to that. To me, that is just unacceptable. And so we need to look at another question here, and that is that in the function of a good government, we clearly do understand that there is a duty of care. Let me go back. Good governments fulfill their purpose to provide conditions under which all its citizens can flourish. There is absolutely no question about that. So, by definition, according to Aristotle, our government is in fact not providing good governance. Now, we could take our government to the bench on a number of issues, how they deal or how they don't deal with issues of corruption, how they, evaluate projects that have clearly an impact on the environment, but also on the citizens of this country. Because after all, a government doesn't own the money that we provide them through our taxes to do things that are for the benefit of the community. What our government appears to be doing a lot of the time is that it's doing stuff that's politically in their best interest, but not for the benefit of the whole constituency, all of the citizens. We have problems with the Minister Dutton and his refugee policies, which are completely inhumane. And if you want to talk about crimes against humanity, let's put it on the table. Let's talk about that. So we, as the people in our community, should be considering these activities of the government in a much broader terms, in a much broader sense. It is ultimately what it is we leave our children to live in. So when we create policies like the current coalition party here, the Liberal National Party, wherein a few benefit but the majority of the people basically left to suffer, then we've got a serious, serious problem. And you'll have heard me talk about the fact that neoliberal politics and economic policies have fundamentally shrunk the middle class. Okay, so is that to our benefit? Does that allow us as citizens to enjoy a good life? Well, I don't think so. And it's our right to put that into perspective. It is our right to expect our government to serve us, to be accountable in their duty of care, in their stewardship of the resources that as a country we have. And clearly, in many respects, I would argue that our government is failing in that. And I would also like to go globally and go, if we look at countries like the UK and the United States, you could make a similar case for those governments. They have a tendency to be neoliberal, to be entrenched in an individualism that basically flips the bird to the rest of the community and says, stuff you, it's up to you on your own. Now, we've had floods recently, and many people were seriously affected, and we had deaths in that. Now, there needs to be serious questions asked in that particular instance about how the government managed that. We had the same problem with the massive bushfires last year. They were the most horrendous fires this country's probably ever seen, with the most devastating impact on many communities. And now, as a result of climate change, we're going to see more of that, and we're going to see more flooding. There's no question in my book that that's exactly what's going to happen. The science is there. Let's look at it. But we have a government that clearly shirks its responsibility, its duty of care to provide the conditions under which all its citizens can flourish. And on that note, I'm going to sign off this week. So let's stay tuned. Let's think deeply about the issues that need to be thought of. And that is that we need to save our democracy, because that's not what we're seeing at the moment. Our politicians are a group of, essentially it's a hegemony in some ways, just like patriarchy. And they need their wings clipped in order to get back to the point that they are a public servant. They've won, unfortunately, a popularity contest, and they've gotten away with a lot without being able to truly be held accountable, because they are protected by our own versions of oligarchs. And if you question whether we have oligarchs in the West or not, then take a closer look at the economic fabric. As I said, neoliberalist economics is a protection racket for the wealthy. Not my words, Nick Hanauer. Look him up. Until next time, next week, I hope you join me again. Take care.
Gunter Swoboda does individual and group coaching for men looking to grow. For more information on this and the global Making Good Men Great movement, check out goodmengreat.com. If you have a topic for the show or would like to be a guest on the air, please email miranda@nortainment.com. That's miranda@NOIRTAINMENT.com. Thank you, and always keep inspiring change.